Enter into a realm of fright, blacker than the darkest night. Your sanity hangs by a thread. Welcome to the House of Dread.
We live in a vast universe filled with phenomenon that we can't understand or explain. Many of us are closed to the idea of believing in things that we cannot experience with at least one of our five senses. But in a world where things happen every day that defy explanation, it's important for us to remain open-minded, lest we allow our ignorance to become our downfall. For the path to our destruction often lies in our own skepticism and our inability or unwillingness to embrace the unknown. Enter Jeffery. Jeffery, a man in his mid-30s, was an aspiring author looking to write and release his first ever New York Times bestseller. Jeffery loved writing fiction as it catered to his highly evolved and very vivid imagination. For a while, he pondered the possibility of writing children's books, but eventually decided he wanted to write more sophisticated and plot-driven material for adults. Jeffery was a quiet, introspective man with a deep love for literature. His mind was a labyrinth of thoughts, ideas, and emotions that he meticulously weaved into his stories. He was observant, noticing the smallest details in his environment that often went unnoticed by others. He was a deep thinker, pondering over life's complexities. Jeffery was a loner by nature, preferring the company of his books and his laptop. His introspective disposition often caused him to become lost in thought, and he was also known for his dry wit and periodic sarcasm. However, despite being highly creative and imaginative, Jeffery was a skeptic through and through, and he was extremely closed-minded when it came to matters of the paranormal. In fact, Jeffery found it very difficult to believe in anything that he couldn't experience with at least one of his five senses. If he couldn't see it, touch it, taste it, hear it, or smell it, then it simply didn't exist. And Jeffery stood firm, his feet planted in the realm of logic and reason, his mind stubbornly shielding itself from the realm of unsolvable mysteries. All of that being said, Jeffery was known to scoff at people who believed in spirits and ghosts. He saw such individuals as superstitious and immature, believing their primitive minds were stuck in a bygone era, almost like cave people who hadn't yet discovered fire. But despite how smug and closed-minded he could be at times, Jeffery secretly battled with a deep internal conflict. He himself would often wonder if there was actually more to life, an aspect of existence that was unseen and unknown to the common person. These two strong aspects of his personality would cause him to vacillate between moments of arrogant certainty and moments of profound doubt. One day, Jeffery's father passed away after a lengthy battle with lung cancer. Jeffery was devastated, as he and his father were quite close, and his father was also his last remaining parent since his mother had died when he was only a child. However, Jeffery's father did manage to leave him a sizable inheritance, and Jeffery decided to use that money to relocate and pursue his passion of becoming a fiction writer. Not long after his father's passing, Jeffrey relocated to a small town in the deep South. Jeffrey thought it would be the perfect environment in which to find peace and inspiration for writing his blockbuster novel. Jeffrey moved into a mid-sized property on the outskirts of town, looking forward to getting himself established so he could begin writing his masterpiece. As an additional source of inspiration, Jeffrey was also looking forward to meeting the locals and getting a more up-close and personal experience of the area. One evening, Jeffrey decided to venture out to get a taste of the nightlife. The streets were buzzing with energy as he walked through the lively town. Music flowed out from the open doors of the local bars and restaurants, mingling with laughter and conversation. The air was thick with the aroma of delicious southern cuisine, enticing Jeffrey's senses and making his stomach rumble. Feeling a sense of adventure, Jeffrey followed the sound of the music, his curiosity leading him to a small, dimly lit lounge. The moment he stepped inside, he was transported to another world. The room was filled with people, their laughter and conversation blending with the smooth melodies that flowed from the jazz band performing on stage. Taking a seat at the bar, Jeffrey relaxed and allowed himself to be swept away by the atmosphere. Suddenly, the bartender walked up and asked Jeffrey if he could get him anything. Jeffrey snapped out of his gaze and told the bartender to get him a glass of bourbon on the rocks. As Jeffrey observed the bartender who was preparing his drink, he noticed something odd about him. The bartender seemed to be somber and melancholy. His eyes held a distant sorrow, as if he carried a weight that no one else could see or comprehend. Now, this was a stark contrast to the vibrant buzz that filled the rest of the lounge. It was as if the bartender was existing in a parallel reality, one filled with despair and a subtle sense of dread. As the bartender brought Jeffrey his bourbon, Jeffrey suddenly felt compelled to ask the bartender if he had something on his mind. On one hand, Jeffrey didn't want to pry, but considering that they were both in a lounge where intimate conversation was usually welcomed and encouraged, Jeffrey felt it couldn't hurt to at least ask. Fortunately, Jeffrey's instincts were correct, and the bartender was open to a bit of conversation. The bartender introduced himself as George and explained to Jeffrey that he was mourning the recent passing of his wife. Jeffrey began to feel slightly awkward and immediately offered his condolences. George said thank you as he continued polishing a row of drinking glasses. George then went on to say that he and his wife ran the lounge together for almost 20 years, and now that she was gone, he had no idea how he was going to go on without her. Again, Jeffrey didn't want to pry, but he couldn't resist the urge to ask George how his wife died. He carefully crafted his words as he leaned forward with a sense of intrigue and childlike curiosity, politely asking George if he would mind sharing how his wife met her demise. There was a moment of silence as George put away the drinking glasses. Then he placed both of his hands on the polished mahogany bar, leaning against it with a look on his face that indicated slight irritation. Jeffrey began to feel embarrassed as he wondered if he had finally overstepped his boundaries and was about to get a serious tongue-lashing from George. "You're not from around these parts, are you?" George inquired with a rather serious tone in his voice. "No, how could you tell?" Jeffrey asked. George turned around and grabbed the same bottle of bourbon he used to pour Jeffrey's drink, firmly set it on the bar, and replied, "Sir, I've been bartending for almost 20 years. I can tell the locals from the newcomers." Jeffrey was starting to feel a bit on edge as he began to wonder just where this conversation was going. George suddenly pointed at Jeffrey's drink and said, "You're probably going to need another one of those after you hear what I'm about to tell you." Now, Jeffrey had no idea what the hell that was supposed to mean, but one thing was for sure. Now George had him hooked. With a determined look in his eyes, George proceeded to ask Jeffrey if he had ever heard the urban legend of Old Man Whispers. Now, of course, Jeffrey said no, and George then proceeded to enlighten him. As the legend goes, Old Man Whispers is an evil ghost that haunts the South. He will visit you on 3 separate occasions. During each encounter with him, you will get 3 chances to tell Old Man Whispers a joke and make him laugh. If you succeed at making Old Man Whispers laugh, he will leave you alone, and you'll be free to live the rest of your life in peace, unburdened by his presence. But if you fail, terrible things will happen to you. And if you still fail to make Old Man Whispers laugh after he comes to you for the 3rd and final time, you will die. George went on to explain to Jeffrey that for reasons unknown, the malevolent entity had come to visit his wife, and that she suffered immensely in her efforts to appease Old Man Whispers, but that she was eventually killed by the evil spirit when she failed to make him laugh after his 3rd and final visit. Jeffrey was at a loss for words. On one hand, he didn't want to be disrespectful and laugh in George's face. Obviously, this man was in deep pain over the loss of his beloved wife. But this was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. A ghost that kills you if you don't make him laugh? It sounded like something straight out of a cartoon. George could tell Jeffrey didn't believe a word he was saying, and that Jeffrey was just trying to be polite and humor him. Nevertheless, George continued. "Listen, I know you don't believe a word I'm saying. When my wife and I first moved here from up north, the locals tried to warn us, and we didn't believe them either. It sounded like complete nonsense. And it has taken all of these years, but we finally found out the hard way. My wife started telling me she heard a terrifying voice commanding her to tell it a joke. She said she would always hear the voice 3 times. I'm ashamed to admit it now, but I thought she was just as crazy as the locals were." Jeffrey could now see tears welling up in George's eyes as he talked. "My wife's health started deteriorating faster than anything I'd ever seen. She lost 30 pounds in only 2 weeks. Then, she almost died in a terrible car crash. I suppose those were her punishments for not making Old Man Whispers laugh. One day, she got so sick that I told her she could stay home while I ran the lounge. But by the time I got back, she was dead." "Well, how do you know she didn't die from her illness?" Jeffrey asked as he sat across from George, looking totally perplexed. George leaned in, looked deep into Jeffrey's eyes, and replied, "Because I found her hanging from the ceiling of our living room. And before you say it was a suicide, let me tell you first of all, my wife never would have done something like that. But what's more, The police couldn't figure out how the hell she got up there in the first place. We have very high ceilings in our house, and my wife was only 5'2". There was no evidence that she used any ladder, table, chairs, or anything that she could have climbed up on to even reach that height. Then the police also said that there were no signs of any forced entry into the house, so it's highly unlikely that somebody broke in and killed her. No, I know who it was. It was Old Man Whispers. George was now fighting like hell to hold back his tears, and Jeffrey sat like a deer in headlights, not knowing what to think, feel, or say. Finally, Jeffrey replied, "I think you were right, George. Hit me with another bourbon." Jeffrey took a big gulp of his freshly poured bourbon. Then he proceeded to ask George some important questions. "So, where did this thing come from? And how does it pick and choose its victims?" George, who by now was wiping his teary eyes with the back of his hand, looked at Jeffrey and said, "As far as I understand, nobody knows where Old Man Whispers came from, or why he chooses certain people. All I can tell you is that if he ever speaks to you, there won't be any doubt in your mind as to who it is. And once Old Man Whispers has spoken, you either make him laugh or you die. It's that simple." "Well, how in the hell am I supposed to know what's gonna make him laugh?" Jeffrey asked, with a hint of unease and tension in his voice. "Sorry, but I don't have an answer for that either," George said, sounding defeated. "If that time ever comes, and for your sake I pray that it doesn't, but if it does, you'll just have to figure it out. Because if you can't, you'll end up like my wife." Jeffrey decided he had heard enough. He thanked George for the drinks, slammed his money down on the bar, and told George to keep the change. Although Jeffrey was sympathetic to George and was sorry for his loss, he figured he'd had enough tales from the crypt for one night. When Jeffrey got home later that night, his heart was heavy, as the moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the quiet suburban street. Jeffrey trudged wearily towards his front door. His mind was a swirling vortex of conflicting thoughts and emotions, a battleground between the skeptic within and the part of himself that desperately wanted to believe. Jeffrey's conversation with George replayed in his mind like a broken record. Every word George spoke that night had burrowed itself deep into Jeffrey's consciousness. Could it be possible? Was the legend of Old Man Whispers true? And more importantly, was a ghost really responsible for the tragic death of George's wife? Did George even have a wife? Was his name really George? Jeffrey's mind was a maze of confusion as he found himself questioning every moment of his encounter with the mysterious bartender. Jeffrey's footsteps echoed eerily as he entered his home. The familiar creak of the door seemed to mock his uncertainty, amplifying the weight of his doubts. The skeptic within him whispered irrational explanations, urging Jeffrey to dismiss George's words as mere drunken ramblings. But the part of him that longed for answers and for closure refused to be silenced. Over the next several days, Jeffrey continued settling into his new home and getting acclimated to his new environment. He continued drawing inspiration from his surrounding neighborhood and the locals that lived there. He couldn't get over how nice and welcoming everyone seemed to be. Finally, he decided that he would revisit the lounge where he had met George. He figured it might be a good idea to apologize for becoming annoyed and ending their conversation so abruptly several nights ago. However, when Jeffrey entered the lounge and approached the bar, George was nowhere to be found. Instead, a strapping young man looking to be in his early 20s was serving the drinks in place of George. Jeffrey approached the young man and inquired about George's whereabouts. The young man went on to inform Jeffrey that George hadn't been feeling well, and so he was unable to come in to work. Slightly disappointed to find out that George wasn't there, Jeffrey decided to just relax and join the rest of the patrons in the lounge. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on an attractive woman sitting alone at a table. Feeling particularly bold, he decided to approach her. With a confident smile, he introduced himself and offered to buy her a drink. To his delight, she accepted, and they began to engage in casual conversation. The woman's warm laughter filled the air, mingling with the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of voices in the background. Jeffrey felt a sense of connection, a glimmer of hope that this encounter could lead to something more. But little did he know, a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Driven by curiosity and flashing back to the conversation he'd had with George only a few days ago, Jeffrey decided to test the waters. He leaned in and asked the woman if she had ever heard the urban legend of Old Man Whispers. It only took a split second for Jeffrey to realize he had made a terrible mistake. Suddenly, the room fell silent, as if time itself had frozen. The once lively lounge became a sea of intense stares, filled with anger and disgust. Even the jazz band had completely halted their performance, their instruments hanging limp in their hands. Jeffrey looked at the woman he had been conversing with, and her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. Jeffrey's heart was racing in his chest, his mind frantically trying to comprehend the sudden shift in the atmosphere. What had he done wrong? Everyone was staring at him as if he had just committed the ultimate act of blasphemy. Old Man Whispers, a name that carried a weight of dread and terror, sent shockwaves through the room. The patrons of the lounge, who once wore friendly faces, now seemed like an angry mob ready to pounce. Their eyes bored deep into Jeffrey's soul, their expressions twisted with a primal hunger for retribution. A voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the tension.
Leave. Now!
The words hung heavy in the air, with a threat that sent shivers down Jeffrey's spine. He stumbled as he quickly rose from the table where he had been sitting. The woman with whom Jeffrey had been enjoying a pleasant conversation only moments before was now looking at him as if she wanted to slit his throat. In fact, everyone was looking at him that way. Jeffrey felt like he was 2 feet tall, and his legs were getting weak beneath him as he tried to make sense of the situation. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or had he unknowingly trespassed into some sort of forbidden realm? Either way, it was apparent that Jeffrey had overstayed his welcome. With each step towards the exit, the atmosphere grew more suffocating as the walls seemed to be closing in on him like a vice. The once inviting lounge now felt like a trap, a labyrinth of unknown horrors. Jeffrey's mind raced. his heart pounding in his ears as he began picking up his pace towards the exit of the lounge. As he finally reached the door, the weight of the crowd's collective gaze lifted, but the fear and terror he felt remained etched in his memory. Jeffrey stepped out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. The lounge's facade, once a haven of comfort, now stood as a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of this seemingly friendly town. Once again, Jeffrey's mind was filled with questions. His thoughts were all consumed by the enigma of Old Man Whispers. Just what in the hell had he stumbled upon? And what would become of him now that he had awakened the dormant terror that lay hidden within the walls of that lounge? Little did Jeffrey know that he would soon be getting the answers to all of his questions. 1 week later, Jeffrey was in the den of his home working on his novel. The memory of his terrifying ordeal at the lounge was still fresh in his mind. Although he struggled to put it behind him, he discovered that he simply couldn't. The piercing stares of the people in the lounge had been seared into his mind, and he was never going to forget how small they made him feel. Frustrated, Jeffrey got up from his laptop and ventured into the kitchen for a glass of wine. Jeffrey stood slowly sipping his glass of Merlot while contemplating his life. He thought about his deceased father and how much he missed him. He thought about his decision to move to the South and how that was working for him so far. Then he recounted his conversation with George, who had since been out of commission, and once again, he recalled the eerie episode with the patrons at the lounge. What did it all mean? Were these events orchestrated by a force outside of his control? Or was there a more practical explanation for all of this? The house was eerily quiet, and time stood still as Jeffrey stood sipping his wine, lost in a sea of his own thoughts. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Jeffrey heard a deep, terrifying, hair-raising voice booming from inside his head as if it was coming from the devil himself.
Tell Whispers a joke.
Jeffrey froze like a statue in absolute terror. This could not be happening. Jeffrey's mind was thrown into a chaotic whirlwind as he struggled to comprehend the horrifying reality unfolding before him. His heart pounded against his chest like a wild beast. Jeffrey's hands, once steady and composed, now trembled uncontrollably, as if possessed by an unseen force. The glass of wine slipped from his grasp, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards upon impact with the unforgiving floor. Disbelief washed over him like a tidal wave, threatening to drown his sanity. How could this be? Suddenly, the booming voice demanded for a second time.
Tell Whispers a joke.
The horror was suffocating Jeffrey's every breath. His body quivered with terror, each tremor serving as a testament to the overwhelming fear that consumed him. Every one of his nerves seemed to be on fire, sending electric shocks of panic coursing through his veins. The terrifying voice, now tinged with a hint of anger, demanded for a third time.
Tell Whispers a joke.
Jeffrey couldn't utter a single word. He was paralyzed with fear. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to do something. But what? Run and hide? Where to? And how do you run and hide from a voice in your own head? Jeffrey's legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, as if they were being held down by invisible chains. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. But all he could do was surrender to the suffocating darkness that enveloped him. Several moments passed, and all was quiet. Jeffrey stood fearfully, anticipating the haunting voice to continue its relentless torment. But nothing happened. At least for now, it was over. Well, it seems that Jeffrey had finally discovered what George and the locals had been talking about. Yes, Old Man Whispers had finally paid his first visit to the non-believer. Jeffrey's breathing, once rapid and shallow, began to slow down, deepening with each inhale and exhale. The tremors that had racked his body began to subside, leaving behind a lingering weakness. Jeffrey's legs, which had felt like jelly moments ago, now felt heavy and laden. Finally able to leave the spot he'd been stuck in for what felt like an eternity, Jeffrey began to stumble forward, his feet dragging across the floor until he finally collapsed in a heap, his body unable to bear the weight of his exhaustion any longer. As he lay on the cold, hard floor of his kitchen, Jeffrey's mind started to piece together the fragments of what had just transpired. Images flashed before his eyes, like scenes from a horror movie. He imagined the twisted face of Old Man Whispers, his eyes burning with a malevolent fire. As Jeffrey was slowly coming back to himself, he began wondering how in the hell this evil spirit got the name Old Man Whispers. The last thing that terrifying voice did was whisper. The chilling sound had a blood-curdling quality to it that seemed to crawl right under Jeffrey's skin. The feeling of being trapped and suffocated by an invisible force was an experience he was never going to forget. Jeffrey lay on the floor trying to wrap his mind around the fact that Old Man Whispers was real, that the terror he had felt was not just a figment of his imagination. It was a truth that shook him to his core, leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew about the world. That night, Jeffrey couldn't sleep a wink. He tossed and turned as his mind replayed the horrifying encounter with Old Man Whispers over and over again. Jeffrey was also suffocating under the crushing weight of his regret for doubting and secretly snickering at George, the bartender. Jeffrey felt a deep sense of shame for not taking George seriously, only to end up on the receiving end of the very same terror that afflicted George. In fact, Jeffrey could hear his heart pounding in his ears again as he recalled George's last words to him, that if he couldn't figure out how to make Old Man Whispers laugh, that he would end up just like George's dead wife. The next evening, Jeffrey was a nervous wreck as he raced back to the lounge in the hopes of being able to tell George about his terrifying encounter with Old Man Whispers. He thought about the last time he was there, when he received the menacing stares from the patrons and was ordered to leave. He wondered if he would be in for a similar or an even worse fate. But right about now, Jeffrey was desperate to see George, and he figured he would take his chances. Jeffrey cautiously entered the lounge. Surprisingly, it was pretty close to empty. A few patrons sat around looking spaced out and paid no attention to Jeffrey as he slowly made his way to the bar. The band continued playing their sleepy jazz music and acted as if Jeffrey wasn't even there. So far, he appeared to be safe. As Jeffrey approached the bar, he noticed the same young man that had been there before standing in place for George. Jeffrey inquired if he could speak to George, and the young bartender hesitated, his eyes shifting away as if he had something serious on his mind. Finally, with a heavy heart, he revealed the unthinkable. The young bartender replied, "George, he's gone. He committed suicide." The words hit Jeffrey like a punch to the gut. George, the bartender, choosing to end his life? On one hand, it seemed plausible, as George did seem to be pretty depressed over the tragic passing of his wife. Still, something didn't quite sound right. The young bartender went on to explain that George had been found by a relative hanging from the ceiling of his home. Jeffrey almost collapsed in the floor. He immediately recalled when George told him about how he found his wife. Jeffrey had the chilling suspicion that this was no coincidence. The mere thought was making him sick to his stomach, but Jeffrey couldn't help but come to the conclusion that Old Man Whispers was to blame. As Jeffrey thanked the young man for his time and slowly walked out of the lounge, his heart was heavy as a ton of bricks. Although he never really knew George that well, he was definitely saddened by his passing and felt a deep connection to the tragic tale that now intertwined their lives. The air outside felt colder, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was mourning the loss of another soul to Old Man Whispers. Again, Jeffrey's mind was a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. The reality of the supernatural force that he had once doubted was now undeniable. It was real, and it had now claimed George, just as it did his wife. The streets were quiet as Jeffrey made his way home, the silence echoing the turmoil within. Thoughts racing through his mind like a flock of startled birds, each one a blur of fear, anger, and sorrow. Jeffrey was on the verge of tears as he contemplated his future. What would he do now that he was facing the terror of Old Man Whispers on his own? What would become of him? Would he be able to figure out how to make the malevolent spirit laugh? Or would he become just another victim in the... In the dim light of a sterile hospital room, Jeffrey's consciousness began to flicker like a candle struggling against a quiet breeze. His awakening was a slow, gradual climb out of the deep, dark pit of unconsciousness. At first, there was only confusion, a sense of floating in an endless void. Then, the world started to take shape around him, coming into focus through a haze of pain and disorientation. The room was a blur of white and beige colors, punctuated by the steady beep of a heart monitor. Tubes and wires snaked from his body, connecting him to an array of machines that hummed and blinked with a rhythm that seemed to mimic the beating of his own heart. Jeffrey's body was a ball of pain, each injury a landmark telling the tale of his brutal encounter. His head throbbed with a relentless ache, a likely souvenir from the heavy blow that had sent him spiraling into darkness. His ribs ached with every shallow breath he took, suggesting that a few might be cracked or possibly broken. His arms and legs were a patchwork of bruises and cuts, some bandaged, others left to heal in the open air. It was clear that he had been through a vicious assault, the kind that leaves both physical and mental scars. In the room, a nurse and a doctor stood by his side, their faces a blend of professional concern and genuine sympathy. They explained to Jeffrey that he had been found unconscious, a victim of physical assault. Witnesses had seen the attack and called the police. Jeffrey was then rushed to the hospital, where he now lay piecing together the fragments of his shattered dignity. Detectives were also present, their silhouettes looming at the foot of Jeffrey's bed. They were seeking answers, hoping Jeffrey could shed light on the attacker. But Jeffrey's mind was a jumbled mess, a swirling fog of images and sounds that refused to align into a coherent memory. Jeffrey wanted to help. He wanted to grab onto something solid in the whirlpool of his thoughts, but all he could remember was talking with the young bartender at the lounge, deciding to walk home, and then an abrupt plunge into darkness. Jeffrey asked the officers if his attacker had stolen his wallet or any other valuables that were on him at the time. The officers replied that surprisingly, his wallet and other valuables hadn't been stolen. The assailant simply left them as if his only goal was to hurt Jeffrey, which was very unusual for such incidents. As the officers prepared to leave, promising to return if Jeffrey remembered anything, Jeffrey lay back against his pillows, a sense of helplessness washing over him. The machines continued beeping and humming, a reminder of the thin thread that connected him to life. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious to the battle being fought in this quiet room, where Jeffrey, surrounded by the trappings of modern medicine, began the long journey back from the edge. As the days and weeks rolled along and Jeffrey lay alone in his hospital room struggling to heal, he began to wonder if his assault was somehow connected to Old Man Whispers. After all, George had told him that each time he failed to make Old Man Whispers laugh, misfortune would fall upon him. Entertaining the possibility that Jeffrey had been beaten within an inch of his life, all because he had failed to make a ghost laugh, was beyond terrifying. He wondered if this was only the beginning of the torment that Old Man Whispers was capable of executing on him. Jeffrey felt his heart beginning to race and his palms getting sweaty as he contemplated another horrifying encounter with Old Man Whispers. But Jeffrey soon realized the added stress couldn't be good for his healing, and so he struggled to put Old Man Whispers out of his mind, at least for now. After a month in the hospital, Jeffrey's doctor informed him that he would be getting discharged in a few days to continue the rest of his healing at home. Jeffrey was overjoyed to hear the news that he would soon be getting out of this dreaded hospital and allowed to complete his recovery in the comfort of his own environment. However, later that night, as Jeffrey lay awake, heart pounding with excitement for his release from the hospital, he received company from an unexpected visitor.
Tell Whispers a joke.
Jeffrey couldn't believe it. That booming, all-consuming, tormenting voice was back with a vengeance, demanding for Jeffrey to amuse it. Jeffrey lay in his hospital bed, eyes wide and frozen with terror. He struggled to formulate his words to speak, to say something, anything that might appease the malevolent spirit. But Jeffrey was paralyzed with fear.
Tell whispers a joke.
That ominous voice cut like a knife through the darkness of Jeffrey's hospital room. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical force, pressing down on Jeffrey, demanding his compliance. The room seemed to close in on him, shadows growing taller and more menacing with each passing moment. Jeffrey could feel the room trembling, or perhaps it was his own body, shaking with an intensity that threatened to shatter his very being.
Tell whispers a joke.
The demand came again, louder and more insistent. Jeffrey's mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts and memories, desperately searching for a joke, any joke, to appease the unseen terror. But a relentless fog clouded his thoughts. Jeffrey's throat was so tight he could barely breathe, suffocating under the crushing weight of horror. Jeffrey realized that this was the third request. Failure to make the evil spirit laugh would once again cause Jeffrey to feel the wrath of Old Man Whispers. Unfortunately, however, Jeffrey's mind was a barren wasteland, devoid of any humor or hope. He wanted to comply, to find the words that would satisfy the ghastly request, but the terror had rendered him mute, a prisoner in his own body. Suddenly, as quickly as it had begun, there was silence. Jeffrey lay there, a shell of a man, feeling defeated and utterly helpless. He knew that he had screwed up once again, failing to make Old Man Whispers laugh. He also knew the consequences for his failure would be swift and potentially fatal. Jeffrey didn't get a wink of sleep that night, and the following morning when the nurses came in to bring him his breakfast, they were puzzled by Jeffrey's look of utter despair. Nevertheless, Jeffrey never mentioned a word about what had happened the previous night. His experience at the lounge when everyone gave him those menacing stares for merely mentioning the name of Old Man Whispers taught him the very valuable lesson that some things were better left unspoken. A few days later, Jeffrey was in the back of an Uber, staring out the window while on his way home. Although he was thrilled to finally be out of the hospital, a part of him was solemn, and he was in a reflective mood. He contemplated the events that brought him to this moment, and he recalled his terrifying second encounter with Old Man Whispers, wondering if this evil spirit would be with him for the rest of his life. In an attempt to distract himself from these unsettling thoughts, Jeffrey turned his attention to the Uber driver. He initiated a cautious conversation, weaving together threads of small talk in the hopes of forming a fleeting connection with another human being. This connection, he believed, might help him to feel just a bit more normal, if only for a little while. As they spoke about the mundane details of their lives, Jeffrey found solace in the simple act of sharing his thoughts and feelings. The driver, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and a comforting voice, listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and understanding. Jeffrey's Uber navigated the streets of the town, twisting and turning like a slithering serpent. As they approached Jeffrey's neighborhood, a sense of unease began to gnaw at his gut. The car slowed, making a final turn onto his street, and that's when he saw it. As the car rounded the final corner, a ghastly sight unfolded before Jeffrey's eyes, almost making his heart stop cold. Jeffrey's house was on fire, a roaring, ravenous inferno. Orange and red crackling flames engulfed Jeffrey's house, showing absolutely no mercy. The house began groaning and creaking as it surrendered to the relentless heat. Jeffrey's legs were trembling beneath him as he climbed out of the car and began stumbling towards the inferno, his heart overcome with fear, anger, and despair. The heat was intense. The flames danced and weaved in front of him like the fingers of an unseen hand, threatening to grab and snatch him into the blaze. Jeffrey's Uber driver called the fire department, and within minutes, sirens were heard quickly approaching the gruesome scene. As the fire trucks arrived, Jeffrey stood frozen, watching the firefighters battle the blaze that was consuming his home. Water from the hoses clashed with the flames, creating clouds of steam that rose into the sky. After the fire had been extinguished, Jeffrey found that his mind was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil that was unfolding all around him. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that this was the work of Old Man Whispers. His mugging and now the burning of his house were both a direct result of his inability to make the ghost laugh on his first 2 encounters. By this point, it was apparent that Old Man Whispers wasn't messing around. Jeffrey knew that the malevolent entity would be back for a 3rd and final encounter, and if Jeffrey failed yet again to make Old Man Whispers laugh, the consequences would be deadly. Poor Jeffrey found himself living out of a dingy motel located at the edge of town. He was totally devastated. All of his personal belongings, including his laptop that he was using to fulfill his dream of becoming a best-selling novelist, had been reduced to ashes. Jeffrey sat all alone in his dimly lit motel room, struggling immensely to hold on to what was left of his sanity. He felt like there was absolutely no one he could talk to or confide in. No one who would believe or take seriously the events that had unfolded over the recent weeks. Jeffrey thought about George, the bartender, and the night George shared his story about what happened to his wife. Jeffrey then began having terrifying visions of someone discovering his body hanging from the ceiling of his motel room. Jeffrey contemplated and ruminated for what seemed like hours, confused, afraid, frustrated, and filled with despair. Jeffrey decided he would try to retire for the night. Not a minute after Jeffrey's head hit the pillow, it began again.
Tell Whispers a joke.
Jeffrey heard the ominous voice of Old Man Whispers once again, commanding him to tell a joke and make the malevolent entity laugh. As thunder rumbled and lightning flashed outside, rain began pouring down. This was Old Man Whisper's 3rd and final visit, and Jeffrey knew it was now do or die. If he failed to amuse the evil spirit this time, Old Man Whispers would indeed kill him. But Jeffrey was tired of being bullied and tormented by this cowardly, unseen entity. He thought about all the suffering Old Man Whispers had inflicted, the stranger who mugged him, the burning of his home, the helpless victims like George the bartender and his innocent wife. The constant berating, intimidation, and fear-mongering had taken its toll. Filled with a surge of anger and indignation, Jeffrey let go of his fear. In a defiant outburst, he began cursing at Old Man Whispers. You,
You are the joke, Whispers. Show your face, you coward. Fuck you, Whispers. Fuck you!
Tell Whispers a joke.
Old Man Whispers demanded for a second time, but Jeffrey stood his ground.
I will not bow to your will or beg for my life. If you want me, take me, you coward. But I'm done being afraid of you.
The air grew cold, and the room seemed to shrink as if the very walls themselves were closing in on Jeffrey. He could feel the presence of Old Man Whispers looming over him, the weight of impending doom hanging heavy in the air. Yet, despite the terror that clawed at his insides, Jeffrey's resolve did not waver. He had faced loss, fear, and the brink of death itself. Now he was ready to confront whatever came next, even if it meant his own demise.
Tell Whispers a joke.
The voice came for a third and final time, echoing through the stormy night with a chilling finality. Jeffrey's heart pounded in his chest, every beat, like the very thunder that rumbled outside of Jeffrey's motel room. He knew this was his last chance, but something in Jeffrey just wouldn't let him submit. Jeffrey took a deep breath, steadying himself. In a bold move, he looked up and defiantly said,
Go straight to hell, Whispers. Go straight to hell!
Suddenly, the room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Jeffrey braced himself, fully expecting the vengeful spirit to strike him down. But to his surprise, the voice did not return. Instead, a strange stillness settled over the motel room. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Jeffrey cautiously looked around, half expecting to see the ghostly figure of Old Man Whispers lurking in the shadows. But the room remained empty and eerily quiet, save for the patter of rain against the window. As the storm outside began to subside, Jeffrey felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a sensation he hadn't felt since he first heard the voice of Old Man Whispers. The fear that had gripped him so tightly began to unravel, thread by thread, leaving behind a cautious sense of relief. He wondered if his defiance had somehow banished the ghost, or if Old Man Whispers had simply grown tired of the game. Either way, Jeffrey knew he had survived the encounter, but at what cost? As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Jeffrey began to notice that subtle but yet profound changes had taken place in his life. The seemingly endless string of misfortunes and calamities that had plagued him since his initial encounter with Old Man Whispers miraculously had come to a sudden halt. Unfortunately, however, Jeffrey found that the memory of those dark, terrifying events continued to linger, casting an ominous shadow over his every waking moment. Despite his respite from the relentless torment, Jeffrey found himself constantly on edge, jumping at the slightest unfamiliar sight or sound, his heart racing with a primal fear that refused to be extinguished. But it wasn't just the fear that had taken root in the depths of his psyche. It was also a newfound, deeply unsettling belief in the unseen and the unexplained. A belief that had been forged in the crucible of his harrowing encounters with the malevolent presence known as Old Man Whispers. Compelled by an almost insatiable need to make sense of his experiences, Jeffrey poured his thoughts and emotions and recollections into his writing, his words flowing with an intensity and depth that he had never known before. His stories, once struggling to find their unique voice, now resonated with the haunting truth of his own personal encounters, imbued with a sense of subtle, underlying tension that hinted at the possibility that the terror of Old Man Whispers may not yet be over. Eventually, Jeffrey was able to finally move on with his life, and he did manage to become a successful author and publisher. Although he never stopped wondering if Old Man Whispers would indeed one day return, and if so, what new horrors would he bring? One thing was for sure, Jeffrey's days as a skeptic were in the rearview mirror. His mind had been expanded far beyond anything he could have ever imagined before Old Man Whispers. He learned the importance of keeping an open mind and respecting the unknown. These lessons not only shaped his writing, but also the way he lived his life. Jeffrey now approached the world with a sense of wonder and caution, aware that not all mysteries could be explained away by logic and reason. As his fame grew, so did the isolation he felt. People loved his stories, praising them for their originality and the palpable sense of fear they evoked. Yet, whenever Jeffrey hinted that his tales might be rooted in personal experience, laughter and disbelief were the usual responses. It was a lonely existence, knowing that the very events that had defined his life and inspired his work were dismissed as mere figments of an overactive imagination. Every day, things happen that we can't understand or explain. Try as best as you can to keep an open mind, and don't be so quick to dismiss something simply because it doesn't make logical sense. Oftentimes, the path to our own destruction lies in our unwillingness to embrace the unknown, to acknowledge that there are powers in this universe that transcend the limitations of our senses, information, and logic. Remember, just like Jeffrey, you may come to discover one day that those shadows lurking in the corners of your room at night are not just figments of your imagination.
If you enjoyed this presentation, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And if you're in need of a narrator for your next project, or you just want to say hello, contact me at thehouseofdread666@gmail.com. Until the next tale of terror, this is Victor Bloodborne. Stay dreadful.